My parents loved me and I loved my parents.
They're the apple of their eyes, their pride and joy, their own flesh and blood.
She went above and beyond, really, what a mother should be.
But for some parents, they aren't just raising their children.
Households often become killing arenas.
They're raising their killers.
She was going, please, get me out, get me out. I said, Mummy, you'll be all right, you'll be all right.
There was a problem in his capacity to understand his own emotions.
There'd been a very bloody scene indeed.
They ultimately overpower their parents in a fit of rage.
A sustained and frenzied attack.
The ritualistic murder of his parents.
If you loved your parents, why did you kill them?
Barry and Elizabeth were a very loving couple. They seemed to be very attached to each other. They had enjoyed a very varied and interesting life.
Married in the 70s, Barry and Elizabeth Dighton went to Singapore to start their life together.
Barry and Elizabeth moved to Singapore when they were young, at the outset of their teaching careers, and they stayed there for quite a considerable time. They established roots there and had many friends in Singapore. They were very well respected members of their local community, involved at many levels and really admired. I think everyone who knew them described them as being very happy in each other's company.
Barry Dighton helped establish the British Hotspurs Football Club and the Tanglin Taverners Cricket Club. And the Dightons would also start a family there with a baby boy called Daniel.
Daniel was born in 1975 and he would have spent quite a large part of his childhood in Singapore. Daniel would have seen much more of life than most children of his age do. He would have met a wide range of children from many different cultures. It would have been quite an exciting place to grow up.
When Daniel was 8, the Dightons would return home.
They then moved back to the UK and settled in South Croydon, a very suburban, genteel and leafy residential part of London.
South Croydon was a fairly affluent and one of the more pleasant areas to live in the suburbs of South London.
Barry and Elizabeth both worked at Elmshurst School for Boys, which was a prep school and a school which was very well regarded.
Barry had been a head teacher and Elizabeth, his wife, was the head of a department.
After a few years, Barry settled into the community by becoming the vice chairman of the Croydon Schools Cricket Association, where Elizabeth would join him at games to keep scores.
From the outside, they would seem as the perfect couple who, having spent so much time together and even worked together as well, which would put a strain on many relationships. Barry and Elizabeth achieved a great deal in their life and seemed to be very settled.
The Dightons' hard work was paying off, and a growing Daniel was reaping the benefits.
The Dightons were a middle-class family. They were reasonably well off. They had their place in South Croydon. They had a holiday retreat in France. Daniel was a much-loved son. He was cared for, supported and provided for.
He never wanted for anything. He was given the best education because of the careers that his parents had and where their careers were.
After he left school, Barry and Elizabeth would also help Daniel get a job.
He was a teaching assistant and he was doing his teacher training at the place where his parents worked, at the school that they taught at. He was the handyman, but he wanted to be what his parents wanted him to be.
Barry and Elizabeth's careers meant they were able to support Daniel financially too.
They'd also bought him a house of his own, and they'd done everything they could to enable him to have his own life.
His parents were financially supporting him. They owned the property that he lived in. He didn't pay any bills. He didn't buy any food. Everything Daniel had been given to him on a silver platter. Even his spending money was given to him by his mum. I think that Daniel thought that if he settled down and did have a family, that his parents would provide for those as well. His parents wanted grandchildren. They wanted him to be in a stable relationship. So he believed that they would continue to provide for him, because they always had.
Despite all the support he was receiving from his parents, Daniel would begin to struggle on his own.
When Daniel had his own house, he just couldn't look after himself. He couldn't do the chores, keep it tidy enough, prepare his own meals, and his mum would have to go over regularly and tidy up on his behalf. He ended up moving back in with his parents because he just couldn't handle it himself.
Now back with his parents, Daniel would split his time between work, home and one other place.
Daniel was a bit of a mainstay in the pub. He seemed to be a larger-than-life character. He was part of the hardcore of the locals that were there. He was going to be one of these that you inherit that's a 7-day-a-week customer that comes in. The pub was very important to him. The pub was very, very important to him. He enjoyed that social aspect. He enjoyed having all those friends around him. And I think he wanted to be liked. And I don't think anybody would have had to have a bad word about him or because he was such a popular guy. He was also another one of these that could drink and drink and drink and drink.
He would drink bitter, and then after he'd had about 8 pints of bitter, he would then start on the JD. But then he'd appear the next day and look the same. He never had a hangover.
As Daniel attended the pub regularly, Steve began to spend more time with him.
He came across as a very well-educated man, to be fair. He was always quite jovial. He seemed quite relaxed with life. He was fun when he needed to be fun, intelligent when he needed to be intelligent, but always an integral part of people's conversations. And a likeable man. People would come in, see him in the pub, and they would always know there was somebody there they could sit down, have a conversation with. And he was that sort of character. He certainly became friend, and because I saw a lot of him, he was just the mainstay at the pub, and we got a good friendship, although he probably knew more about me than I knew about him.
Despite growing closer to him, Daniel's life still seemed a mystery to Steve.
He never mentioned anything to me about his family at all. They'd never been in the pub with him. I wouldn't know if he had sisters or brothers or extended family that lived local. He was always talking about the world, if you like, and everything in Croydon and beyond. And it never really got that personal or intimate about his family stuff.
The only thing that we knew about his parents were what their jobs had been and that they were Crystal Palace supporters.
But Steve and Julie would become aware of a pivotal moment in Daniel's personal life.
He told us he was a teacher and that he taught at the school across from the pub, which was one of the top private schools in the country, where his parents had both held senior roles, and that when his parents had retired, he'd also left.
After being the head teacher at Elmshurst for 20 years, Barry had retired, and he was still apparently actively involved with the school, but on an unofficial part-time level, I think just because he enjoyed that so much.
Daniel also left his job at the school alongside his parents. But their retirement would allow Barry and Elizabeth to become more aware of their son's habits.
He was the only child of Barry and Elizabeth, that he would have had plenty of opportunities to succeed, to forge his own career. But unfortunately, it seemed that he was never really capable of making that step. His life seemed to be one in which he was not really achieving much, not really able to get to a place that his parents would have wanted him to.
Daniel was now in his 30s, living at home, unemployed and drinking all day. But for how much longer could his newly retired parents put up with his lifestyle? "30-year-old Daniel Dighton had been given every chance in life by his supportive parents. While Barry and Elizabeth were enjoying their hard-earned retirement, Daniel would be spending all his time at the pub.
He would attend any social event that was thrown by the locals, just genuinely socialising. He would just come and join in any conversation, and he fit in whatever the social situation was.
And his friendships in the pub had even earned him a nickname.
Daniel had a nickname. It was Duckfish. When he played poker, he had his own poker face, which looked like a duck. So he got the name Duckfish, which happens a lot in pubs. People do end up with nicknames, and in a good, strong community pub, that tends to stick.
There was also something about Daniel's persona that caught Julie's attention.
Most men that I know that support a football team, if they go to the trouble of supporting them at home every week, if a goal is scored by a home team, you react. If the goal is scored against you, you react even more. That never happened. I never, ever, ever saw Dan react. He never reacted. He just carried on sitting there with his drink in front of him.
Daniel had a large group of friends at the pub, but people knew very little about his life. And a visit to his family home, which Daniel told his friends was his own, would cast further doubt.
Some people had been round to his house and they'd expressed that it was not what you'd expect a house to be for the average 34, 35-year-old single man. It was very oldie-worldy. There was a lot of ornaments that were clearly dated from the 60s and 70s. The decor and the furniture was not what you'd expect from a man living alone in 2010. But they'd also said that when they'd gone round to the house, he'd expressed that the house was his, and it was made clear that there was nobody else living in the house at all. It probably looked a little bit strange, but quite normal for a guy to be living like that if he wanted to. It was his choice. He lived alone, and if he wanted to have old trinkets from family heirlooms, etc. around, then so be it. So it was never questioned. If Daniel told us something, then people would take that 100% at face value. There was no standout reason why you would distrust this man.
Barry and Elizabeth were now retired, and they would make a huge decision about their son.
I think for his parents, who were obviously very affectionate and caring parents in the way that they brought Daniel up, he had become a burden, even though they obviously loved him greatly.
Daniel had been told that his parents were going to cut him off. They weren't going to carry on funding his lifestyle, that he had to get a job. He had to learn to support himself. Now they were saying to him, you're a 34-year-old man who's never had a proper job. You need to start living life properly without your parents' support. We're not going to continue funding your drinking lifestyle. I don't know anybody else that at that age has never bought a drink or food out of money that they've earned themselves. Ever.
It appeared that being cut off by his parents was exactly the push that Daniel needed, and his friends couldn't have been happier for him.
Daniel had told us he'd got a job at a Montessori school in Thailand, and he was going to Thailand to teach.
So we decided to give him a going-away party because he was going to go away for an indefinite time. The whole place was packed because he was a popular guy and we wanted to give him a good send-off. If I recall, there was presents given to him, farewell messages, and we partied because, again, he was an integral part of the team or an integral part of the community. So we gave him a hell of a send-off and sent him on his merry way to Thailand. Daniel leaving to go to Thailand was going to be a loss for the community, for the pub, and for those in that close-knit circle of the customers, a proper band of brothers, and he was part of that.
Daniel left for Thailand following the party and continued to stay in touch with his friends at the pub while away.
Daniel was sending emails and texts to his friends back in London about what was happening to him in Thailand, giving them details that gave the impression of him living a life in Thailand.
With Daniel believed to be away, an unexpected sighting would confuse people at the pub.
We didn't see him for probably about 6 weeks. And then someone came into the pub and said that they'd seen Daniel having his hair cut.
Across the rumour mills, quickly gathered pace. Why is Daniel back? Why is Daniel back? Why has he not told anybody?
Having been spotted in Croydon, Daniel would provide a reason for his reappearance.
He came into the pub and announced that he'd had to return home because of the death of his mother. He was very upset at the loss of his mum, and there was a little bit more of a quietness about him. He was still coming in the pub every day, but there was a lot of sympathy around. Everybody was just very supportive towards him, and he did seem quite emotional.
Daniel, he wasn't an emotional person. The fact that he cried on my shoulder on the day seemed to shock him as much as it shocked me, because he'd never ever displayed any emotion to anything.
Devastated for their friend's loss, Steve and Julie did everything they could to support Daniel.
We arranged a collection for flowers. There was a florist across the road from the pub, so myself and Steve went over there and arranged for the flowers. We collected them on the morning, and 2 of our locals were going to the funeral. They collected flowers and went off to the funeral, and then subsequently came back with flowers and said that there was no funeral of that name at that place. Daniel then came into the pub later on and said that his father had changed it and he'd just forgotten.
The friends spent a whole day, apparently, driving around churches in the area trying to find the funeral for Daniel's mum, but there was no funeral because his mum was still alive.
Unbeknown to his friends, Daniel had lied about the death of his mum, and that wasn't the only lie he was telling.
In fact, Daniel didn't go to Thailand at all. He actually spent some time in Normandy that summer at the holiday home that his parents owned. He was quite accustomed to bragging in the pub, which seemed to be the epicentre of his world. He probably didn't want to admit that he'd actually failed to be considered for the job. He had to keep up the pretense that he'd actually been away in Thailand, and in order to do that, in order to convince his friends that he'd been in such a hot country, he applied fake tan to his face, to his body, so that he looked as though if he'd been lying on a sunbed.
The question about the function his lies serve, so is this satisfying purely a need within him? I wonder whether at times he starts to believe his own fantasies, so whether he always has a clear distinction between fantasy and reality. The evidence doesn't suggest that he is completely disconnected from reality in the way that someone with a psychotic illness may be, but I do question whether his fantasizing does cause him sometimes to lose touch with what's going on around him. In that moment, he starts to believe what he has falsely claimed. If a lie that has been well crafted does start to be exposed, start to unravel, then that can lead the individual to feel very threatened, very vulnerable, and they may not know how to react to that.
Keeping the secret of his mum's fake death to himself, Daniel continues life as normal, and weeks later he enjoys a trademark drinking session.
The afternoon was spent with just me and him in the pub. We had a pool match that night, of which he stayed for. Some of the players decided they were going to go into Croydon to have a late drink, and Daniel was asked to join them, which he did do. They decided they were going to get a late drink in a strip club in Croydon.
He'd managed to buy drinks, having taken £80 out of his dad's wallet, and he became really drunk and came in very late. The following morning, Daniel was sleeping off his hangover after a late, boozy night out. His parents were out shopping, doing the weekly groceries, and they came back around midday, and they discovered Daniel still in bed. Daniel's mum went into his room to wake him up, and she then had an argument with him. She demanded to know where he'd got the money in order to spend the whole previous evening out drinking with his friends. His parents were fed up with funding his reckless, debauched lifestyle. As she left the room, she obviously was really angry with him, and she described him as an idiot, and that was what triggered his anger.
34-year-old Daniel Dighton was jobless, living at home and spending all of his time at the pub. And after a particularly heavy drinking session, Daniel woke up the following morning with a hangover. However, concern is growing among Daniel's friends, who haven't heard from him since he disappeared the night before.
I opened the pub at midday on the Wednesday. I'd had a couple of messages from people saying that they'd lost Daniel in the strip club. They didn't know if he'd probably just gone home. I mean, he was always one of the last men standing anyway, but he certainly wouldn't get up and leave and just go without a bite. Text messages were sent. I know people tried to ring him, and we got the same response with the phone. The phone was inactive. Over the period of the day, people drifted into the pub, and we'd ask the general conversation, anybody seen Daniel, anybody heard from Daniel? It wasn't to the point of mass hysteria, but there was a general concern.
But at the Dighton household, the previous night was the final straw for Barry and Elizabeth, who were fed up with their son's lifestyle.
Daniel continued to shout at his mum. He was absolutely furious, and he followed her first into the kitchen, and they had arguments quite often, but his mum tried to tone it down. Right in the middle of this ferocious row, she told him that she loved him, and he replied, "I love you too, Mum." But despite of that, the argument got more and more heated.
With the argument now escalating, the noise begins to travel, causing neighbours to become concerned.
A neighbour heard the mother, Elizabeth, shouting, screaming, "Barry, no," suggesting that her husband was trying to intervene and separate Daniel from his mother in this argument that was carrying on and getting worse by the second. The neighbours who'd heard the very distressing screams and shouting coming from the house called 999.
The police arrive at the Dightons' home, and Senior Investigating Officer Bob Campany's team attend the scene.
We got the call around lunchtime because uniform officers had attended the scene, and as a result of being called by a neighbour who had reported sounds of a violent altercation, which was unusual for that household. When the officers turned up, they were met with a pretty gruesome scene. Elizabeth was laying on the floor, and her husband was a few feet away, slumped in an armchair. Both clothing was heavily blood-stained, as were areas of the lounge. Soon after establishing that life was extinct, officers carried out a search of the premises.
While looking around the house, police hear movement in the loft and believe it's where the killer is hiding.
It was an extremely brave job by the uniform officers. They had to make the decision what they were going to do. They were not to know that he wasn't concealing another weapon about him and could have been equally as violent towards them.
Police proceed up the ladder with caution and are faced with something unexpected.
Daniel went upstairs to the attic room and he hid behind a chimney breast and lit a cigarette, which was where he was found when officers came in. He told the police officers that the reason he'd gone upstairs to smoke was that was the place he was allowed to smoke in the house. He was forbidden from smoking downstairs, which is obviously quite peculiar and very telling, I suppose, about the way he thought his parents controlled him, that even though they were lying downstairs dead at his hands, he was still obeying their rules.
With Daniel cornered, the police now need to arrest him, which proves easier than they'd imagined.
Daniel was summoned down by the officers. He was promptly arrested for the murder of his mother and father, handcuffed and taken to Croydon Police Station. And when he was arrested, he actually said to the officers, "I don't usually lose my rag like that." Daniel was assessed by a medical practitioner in order to assess his capability to be interviewed. And he was interviewed by police officers, but he chose to make no comment. The only thing we had from Daniel was that modest admission at the scene to the arresting officers, which is kind of frustrating as an investigator. You want to hear what that person has to say.
By now, the news of Daniel's arrest is spreading around the community and finally reaches Steve and Julie Lowe.
I had a phone call from one of my customers saying they'd heard Daniel had been arrested. So we tried to put two and two together. Maybe there had been an incident at the strip club which he got involved in. His timeline stopped at the strip club. Subsequently, if something had happened on the way home, an altercation or something like that. And then my wife rang me to say that she had members of the press outside the pub banging on the door, wanting to come in. And this was the story, that Daniel Dighton had been arrested, his parents were dead, and he was helping the police with the inquiries. The first thought that crossed my mind was, this is strange because his mum died 5-6 weeks ago.
With Daniel now in custody, police are finally able to assess the crime scene to find out what happened on that fateful day.
With a self-contained homicide such as this, where you've got the scene, the victim and the suspect all in close proximity, you have to guard against being complacent. There's still a lot of work to be done. The analogy I would use is that you're walking down the corridor with your prisoner, and the last door you go through is the door to conviction. And all the other doorways en route are potential escape routes, and you have to make sure that they're firmly locked shut. One of the primary lines of inquiry was the integrity of the house. And by that, I mean who else had access, whether legitimately or illegally, whether there were any doors or windows open or broken, who else had keys to the property. And in doing that, you go some way to negating the possibility of third-party involvement.
Detectives managed to rule out intruder involvement, but now they need to prove that Daniel was capable of such an horrific act of violence.
One thing we did notice is that Daniel in his bedroom had a huge collection of DVDs where the prevalent theme was violence. It was something that certainly was relevant in terms of, a motive would suggest there was some degree of planning and thought process, and we didn't think that was the case. It was very much a spontaneous attack, but clearly with such violent DVDs, it gives you an idea of his mindset. The toxicology report indicated that Daniel had a high level of alcohol in his bloodstream, and we know that that can sometimes heighten aggression levels with individuals.
It's known that there is an association between alcohol intoxication and propensity to violence. That doesn't mean that everyone who's intoxicated with alcohol becomes violent, but it increases the risk, particularly for those people who may have some sort of underlying propensity or underlying vulnerability. The way alcohol has that effect is that, firstly, the individual becomes less concerned about the consequences of their actions, so they're not looking as far ahead and they're not considering the adverse effects of what they may do. Secondly, they may become more sensitive to interventions from other people. So if that's a threatening intervention, a hostile intervention, they may overstate the importance of that. Or if that's a challenge to them in some way, then it may be seen as more significant when they're intoxicated in a way that it wouldn't if they were sober.
Following further lines of inquiry with neighbours and people who knew the family, Bob believes he has an idea of what happened inside the Dighton home.
Upon returning home from a shopping trip, Mr. and Mrs. Dighton found Daniel in bed nursing yet another hangover. This clearly ignited an argument, during which Daniel became consumed with rage, and he attacked his mother first with 2 kitchen knives, stabbing her 28 times. Barry, her husband, came to her rescue, and he was dispatched with 4 stab wounds to the chest. Daniel was clearly consumed with rage. It may have been because something his mother said during the argument that ignited that rage, but it was an extremely vicious attack.
Overkill is a concept that criminologists use, and it refers to incidents of homicide where there's an excessive use of violence that is much more than that it's required to kill a person. It's often used by investigators because they think that it tells us something about the dynamic, and there's an idea that the more excessive force that's used, or the more overkill that's used, then the closer the relationship between victim and offender. Overkill can also tell us something about the psychological motivation or the psychological state of the offender. So, for example, if there's overkill, perhaps the motivation is an expression of emotion, for example, perhaps anger.
There was no indication that Mr. and Mrs. Dighton were oppressive towards Daniel at all. No suggestion that they were thwarting his aspirations in any shape or form. To all intents and purposes, they were a caring, loving family. Maybe Mr. and Mrs. Dighton were frustrated about their son's lifestyle. Maybe they're at their wits' end with him. Maybe they've been on a collision course for some time when the perfect storm erupted. I don't know. But certainly the demon in Daniel came out in spectacular and violent fashion on that day. Who knows what goes on behind closed doors? We know that households often become killing arenas.
With the crime scene analysed, police want to talk to people who know Daniel, and Steve and Julie discover that Daniel has been arrested on suspicion of his parents' murder.
It was an incredible shock, because this man that had been our local and had been a stalwart of the pub has suddenly been accused of something that is absolutely horrendous. And to try and get your own mind around that is very, very difficult.
The police arrived and said that they wanted to interview various members of the pub community. So they wanted to know what I thought of him. And the very last question they asked me was, what was my impression of him? To which I replied that I would never have imagined Daniel would be capable of doing that. That was what people were talking about in the pub that day. Are you sure it's the right Daniel? Nobody believed it until the police came. But some people still didn't believe what had happened.
Following the events, a couple of weeks pass, but an unexpected call would confuse them even further.
Myself and my wife were out for a day in London, and a number came up on my phone, which was a London number. I immediately took the call because I assumed it was something to do with the pub. And it was Daniel ringing me. So after the initial shock, he did say, "You've heard what's happened." And I said I did. A very, very strange phone call to take.
Steve was now on the phone with a killer, and it left him with one question. Did anybody know the real Daniel Dighton? After the bodies of Barry and Elizabeth Dighton were discovered, their 34-year-old son Daniel was arrested for their murders. Having given little explanation when questioned, the police determined that Daniel exploded in a fit of rage. And news of the deaths of the highly popular Dightons had begun to reach the people whose lives they'd most influenced.
There seemed to be a huge outpouring of affection for both Barry and Elizabeth. There were really glowing tributes from their former pupils who had benefited so much from the education that they'd given them. And there were many people who came forward to talk about how they'd really enjoyed their company and respected everything that they'd achieved.
Meanwhile, pub landlord Steve found himself on an unexpected phone call with Daniel.
It was like having a conversation with somebody that was working away. It was a catch-up call. He asked how the pool team were doing, how the individual characters were doing, was we doing well in the pub. What he'd done to his parents was never mentioned. And it was just having a phone call from an old friend that had moved away. He seemed quite jovial, quite relaxed, and he just wanted to catch up. And that was probably the end of the conversation.
The observations of his behaviour after the offence add to the impression that there is something odd in the way that he understands what's happening around him. So his behaviour suggests that he didn't appreciate the significance of what had happened, the seriousness of the gravity of what had happened. He's reacting in a way that seems slightly disconnected from it. And I think there's other evidence of his emotional state not matching the circumstances that he's in.
Following the phone calls, Daniel promises Steve and Julie to write to them from prison. And only a few weeks later, the letters start to arrive.
The letters he sent made a point of pointing out different characters in the pub and asking if they were still doing this, still doing that. I think there was a lot of anger towards him once everything had come out, the fact that he'd told everybody lies. So the letters, in a way, reignited that anger with some people. They didn't want to write back to him. Obviously, the biggest one was the death of his mother. Now, to say that you've lost a family relative to gain sympathy is awful. But to conjure up such a story about having to return from a foreign country and a job you were doing to return for your mother's funeral, that's when people started to say, well, you know, who was this man?
The fake wake is an indication of an elaboration of his ability to falsify information, and to quite an extreme level. So I think the fake wake possibly illustrates two issues. One is this is a further development of his tendency to elaborate and to falsify information. And secondly, whether this reflects some contemplation of what he is going on to do. So is at some level he aware of what he goes on and does?
You do question yourself because you think, well, I trusted this guy, you know, and I believed everything he said. I think a lot of it was shocking because it was what you would call petty lies, but it built up then a whole general picture of the fact that the guy was constantly lying to us.
And while in prison, Daniel's deception would continue.
While Daniel was in custody awaiting trial, he'd actually attempted to buy some psychiatric case notes from another prisoner. This was just another example of his compulsive lying that he just couldn't stop.
Over a year after the killings of his parents, Daniel Dighton's trial at the Old Bailey begins.
When it came to the trial, he declined to give his account. He didn't want to get in the witness box. When the crime scene pictures were shown at court, Daniel didn't want to be there. He didn't want to see the pictures, so he was led away. The jury saw the crime scene pictures. I did feel at times that there was a slight imbalance in the tone of the trial. That's to say, on occasions you felt that Daniel was the victim and there wasn't quite enough compassion for a thoroughly decent, loving couple who had their life terminated in the most brutal fashion.
With Daniel refusing to talk, witnesses are called to the stand, including the manager of Daniel's pub, Julie Lowe.
What subsequently emerged was what I said in the trial, something that I would never have thought Daniel would do. He would have been the last person that I ever thought would commit anything like that. I said it then and I would say it now. I would never have thought that he would ever have done anything like he did.
While testifying at court, Daniel's behaviour begins to make Julie feel uncomfortable.
The judge directs you to give your answers to the jury. The dock is to the right and the jury is further to the right. So every time a lawyer spoke to me, I then had to turn past Daniel and look at the jury, and every single time he was just standing there smiling at me. And it was just a normal sort of smile that you'd give when you were pleased to see somebody. It wasn't like, I'm sorry I put you in this position, or I'm regretful that I'm in this position. It was just a genuine smile. That was just the weirdest thing I have ever seen.
And Julie is horrified to hear further evidence about the brutal murder Daniel is being accused of.
The neighbour overheard Daniel's mum saying, Dan, I love you, what are you doing? Stop, I love you. And he replied, I love you too, Mum. If somebody tells you they love you, your first reaction is either to go for a hug or to just stop what you're doing and think, but to carry on what you're doing, to do it to two parents, and so relentless. It's the only word I can think of. 26 times on one parent and 8 on the other. And then to just go and stand in the loft and not even attempt to call for help. I must admit, I was shocked.
Daniel's responsibility for his parents' deaths was undeniable, but one question still remained.
The only point of contention was whether it was murder or manslaughter. A leading psychiatrist gave evidence at the trial, and his opinion was that Daniel had definitely lost his temper and it was a sort of spur-of-the-moment action.
and the defence's psychological report would also point to a prolonged issue.
At the same time, his behaviour in his assessment showed something he referred to as cognitive disability, which suggests that there is a longer-term problem in his interactions with the world.
I felt that he didn't believe he was in the situation that he found himself in. I think he knew. That's why he was smiling. Because he'd always got away with whatever he said. He'd always got away with whatever he'd done, whatever he'd said, his lies, he'd always got away with them. And I truly believe he knew that he would be found not guilty. The police were convinced he would be found guilty. I don't believe Daniel was guilty with diminished responsibility. I believe he was guilty.
After 2 weeks, the jury's verdict was due.
Daniel was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He was sentenced to an indefinite term in prison to serve a minimum of 15 years. It was quite a severe sentence, and I was content with that. Whether his intelligence was impaired at all in any respect, which made it manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, I don't know. Or was it a case of he just lost his temper? Daniel didn't show any emotion, even when he was found guilty of manslaughter. He gave no reaction in court at all.
Daniel experienced an acute stress reaction. So that suggests that there was a sudden dramatic change in his mental state from how he was before to a very different and disordered mental state. The exact nature of that, I'm not sure, but it's likely that there was a trigger for the acute stress reaction. One might imagine that the trigger has to be very significant given the nature of his subsequent actions, but it doesn't have to be. It can be quite an objectively trivial trigger. It may have grave psychological meaning to him, but the trigger itself from an objective standpoint may not need to be that significant.
It emerged during the trial that detectives had found a poem that Daniel had written dedicated to his mother, Elizabeth. He'd actually called it Poem for Mum, and he wrote the words, "I love you, my heart is full of love, that is true. You tore my world apart, what do I do?"
There's lots and lots of kinds of people that engage in parricide, but looking at the research, what we can identify is a kind of most common profile, and it usually tends to be male as the offender, in their 30s, and their victims in their 60s, often unemployed, often living at home with their parents, and their parents are often together, and it's what sometimes are referred to as intact families, so still married or cohabiting.
Daniel didn't seem like the most scheming, calculating murderer. It seemed as though what he was doing was a reaction rather than something that had been planned and thought through. But there was also a side of his character that was quite deceptive. He was always trying to get away with fabricating stories, and perhaps that was part of the reasons for him doing what he did. Just so horrible that the two people who seemingly gave him more than anyone else were the two victims that he murdered.